Picture this. You're standing in the Sonoran Desert of 1850, and the world is about to explode. Not literally, though sometimes it might as well have been. Three completely different civilizations are about to collide over the same piece of Earth. And when I say collide, I mean like freight trains meeting head-on in a tunnel with no way to back up. For centuries, and we're talking about a time span that makes the entire history of the United States look like a weekend. Apache bands had been moving through what they considered their homeland in seasonal patterns as predictable as sunrise. Spring meant gathering mescal in the desert valleys, those tough century plants that could sustain a family for weeks if you knew how to prepare them. Fall brought deer hunting in the pine-covered mountains, where warriors would disappear for days and return with enough meat to see their people through winter. And when winter stores ran low, well, that's when they'd raid Mexican settlements to the south. Now, before you start thinking raiders equals bad guys, let me paint you a different picture. This wasn't random violence, this was an economic system that had worked for generations. The Apache world operated on completely different rules than what was coming. Land belonged to whoever could hold it and use it. Raiding brought honor and resources. And if someone killed your family member, blood payment wasn't just expected, it was required by everything they held sacred. Think about it this way. Imagine aliens landed tomorrow and told you that the concept of buying groceries was now illegal, that the house your family had lived in for generations now belonged to someone else because they had a piece of paper, and that defending yourself when attacked made you a criminal. That's essentially what happened when Americans started arriving in Apache territory with their surveys and their land grants and their utterly foreign concept that you could own a piece of earth like you owned a horse. The collision point came at a place called Dragoon Springs in 1861. Picture a landscape so harsh it makes Death Valley look like a resort, jagged mountains rising from scorched desert floor, where the only shade comes from creosote bushes, and the only water from hidden springs known to those who'd been born to this country. Cochise was there. Not just any Apache, this was a man who stood over 6 feet tall in a time when most people barely reached 5.5 feet, a Chiricahua chief whose name meant strength of oak, and who had every reason to believe he could work with these new arrivals. He'd been meeting peacefully with Americans, even helping them understand the country. But then came Lieutenant George Bascom, fresh from West Point and absolutely convinced that Cochise had kidnapped a rancher's stepson. What happened next was like watching a carefully constructed dam develop a crack that would eventually flood an entire valley. Bascom invited Cochise to a parley under a white flag of truce, and you have to understand, this wasn't just military protocol we're talking about. Among Apache, violating a truce flag was like spitting on everything sacred. It was the one thing that made negotiation possible between peoples who might be at war. Cochise came to that meeting expecting to talk, maybe even help find the missing boy. Instead, Bascom accused him of the kidnapping, and when Cochise denied it because he genuinely hadn't done it, the lieutenant decided to take Cochise's family hostage until the boy was returned. Picture that scene, warriors reaching for weapons, soldiers leveling rifles, and in the middle of it all, Cochise realizing that everything he thought he understood about these Americans was wrong. But here's where you see why Cochise became a legend. Instead of surrendering, he pulled out a knife and literally cut his way through the canvas wall of the tent, escaping into the desert while bullets flew around him. He got away, but his brother and 2 nephews didn't. They remained prisoners in that army camp, and Cochise knew exactly what he had to do next. What followed was a masterclass in psychological warfare that would make modern special forces take notes. Cochise captured 6 Americans, not random civilians, but people connected to that betrayal, and then, in sight of the army camp where his family was being held, he tortured all 6 to death, slowly, methodically, making sure the soldiers could hear every scream. When the smoke cleared and the negotiations finally ended, both sides had executed their prisoners. Cochise's family was dead. The Americans were dead, and 20 years of the most vicious frontier warfare in American history had just begun. But Cochise wasn't the only Apache leader pushed past his breaking point. Down in the Warm Springs country lived a man the Mexicans called Mangas Coloradas Red Sleeves, though his Apache name was Dasoda Hay. Picture a giant by the standards of any era. 6 feet 4 inches tall, broad as a barn door, with the kind of presence that made other warriors step aside when he walked into a room. Mangas had tried the diplomatic route even longer than Cochise. He'd actually guided American surveyors through his territory, believing that understanding might lead to coexistence. He'd even agreed to meet with soldiers under another flag of truce at Fort McLean in 1863. That's when he learned that Apache trust was a one-way street as far as the Americans were concerned. The soldiers captured him, and what they did next tells you everything you need to know about how far the situation had deteriorated. For entertainment, and I want you to really think about that word, they heated bayonets in their campfire until they glowed red-hot, then pressed them against the soles of this 60-year-old chief's feet. When Mangas protested, they shot him dead and claimed he was trying to escape. But here's the detail that still makes historians shake their heads. They cut off Mangas Coloradus's head and sent his skull to the Smithsonian Institution as a scientific specimen. Think about that. The military leadership of the United States government thought it was appropriate to decapitate a foreign leader and ship his remains to a museum. If that doesn't tell you how completely dehumanized the Apache had become in American minds, nothing will. The violence spiraled from there like a wildfire in drought conditions. Apache raids left entire mining camps abandoned, their inhabitants fled or dead. Mail routes became graveyards of burned wagons and scattered bones. And the army? General George Stoneman was trying to fight Apache warriors with conventional cavalry tactics that might have worked against European armies but were utterly useless in this terrain. Picture heavily loaded cavalry horses trying to pursue Apache warriors who could cover 70 miles a day on foot through mountains that didn't appear on any map. It was like trying to catch smoke with a butterfly net. The Apache knew every waterhole, every hidden trail, every cave that could shelter a war party. They could live on foods that would poison a white man and navigate by stars that cavalry officers couldn't even identify. By 1871, Arizona settlers had decided the army couldn't protect them, so they'd take revenge into their own hands. At Camp Grant, where over 100 peaceful Apaches were living under military protection, people who had actually surrendered and were trying to adapt to reservation life, vigilantes struck at dawn. What they did there defies description. But I'll try anyway because you need to understand how far this conflict had fallen into pure barbarism. They didn't just kill those Apache families, they beat them to death with rocks and clubs, mostly women and children. 144 human beings murdered while they slept, people who had been trying to live peacefully under American protection. And 29 Apache children, think about this, were sold into slavery in Mexico. The Camp Grant massacre shocked even hardened frontiersmen who had seen plenty of violence. It convinced Washington that their current approach wasn't just failing, it was creating a humanitarian disaster that was making the United States look like barbarians to the rest of the world. Something had to change, and it had to change fast. The question was, what do you do when conventional military tactics have failed completely? When the enemy knows the terrain better than you know your own backyard? And when the cycle of revenge has become so vicious that both sides are committing atrocities that would make devils blush? The answer was about to come from an unlikely source, a general who had been watching this disaster unfold and developing ideas that would change everything. But to understand what he was planning, you need to understand just how completely the Apache had mastered the art of guerrilla warfare in their own backyard. General George Crook arrived in Arizona Territory in 1871, with ideas so radical they made his fellow officers question his sanity. Picture a West Point graduate who had spent years fighting Sioux and Cheyenne on the northern plains, walking into the furnace of Apache country and doing something no American military leader had done before. He actually studied his enemy. Not just their fighting techniques, though those were impressive enough, but their entire way of life. How they moved through terrain that would kill a cavalry horse in 2 days. How they survived on foods that most soldiers couldn't even identify, let alone digest. How they communicated across vast distances using smoke signals that could carry complex messages faster than any telegraph line. Crook approached Apache warfare like a scientist studying a new species, and what he discovered was both humbling and terrifying. The math was simple, and Crook was nothing if not a practical man. You had Apache warriors who could cover 70 miles a day on foot through mountains that existed on no map. They knew every water source, every hidden trail, every cave that could shelter a war party. They could live indefinitely on pine nuts, cactus fruit, and whatever they could hunt or raid. Meanwhile, you had cavalry units that needed supply trains, predictable water sources, and terrain suitable for horses. It was like trying to catch a wolf pack with a parade float. But here's where Crook's genius showed. Instead of trying to out-Apache the Apache, he decided to recruit them. The idea was so obvious that it took a special kind of military mind to see it. Only Apache could catch Apache. Only people who thought like Apache could predict Apache movements. Only warriors who knew every inch of this country could track other warriors through it. At Camp Apache, Crook began what amounted to the most unusual recruitment drive in American military history. His proposition was elegantly simple. Regular pay of $13 a month, more money than most reservation Apache saw in a year. Steady rations for families who were often one failed hunt away from starvation. And perhaps most importantly, for men who had been warriors since childhood, the chance to continue the life they understood: tracking, hunting, and fighting. The first man to step forward was Alcacay of the White Mountain Apache. And if you're going to understand this story, you need to understand him. Picture a natural leader in his 30s, a man who could read sign like a book and who understood that the old way of life was ending whether he liked it or not. Alcacay looked at Crook's offer and saw something his people desperately needed: a way to remain warriors while adapting to a world that no longer had room for traditional Apache resistance. Then came Deadshot, whose name tells you everything you need to know about his skills with the new Springfield rifles the Army was issuing. But perhaps the most symbolically important recruit was Mickey Free, the one-eyed half-Apache whose kidnapping as a child had started Cochise's war in the first place. Now he was volunteering to guide soldiers through the very Dragoon Mountains where he'd learned to think like an Apache. Think about the psychological complexity of that. The boy whose capture had launched 20 years of warfare now helping to end it. Scout training created something entirely new in military history: a fusion of Apache survival skills with Army discipline. Morning drill might teach them to march in formation and handle their weapons according to regulation. But afternoons were spent teaching soldiers how to read moccasin prints in sand, how to find water in barrel cactus, how to move through country without leaving sign that could be followed. In the camps, two worlds merged in ways that would have been unthinkable just months before. Apache scouts performed their traditional sunrise prayers while Army bugles played reveille. They mixed government hardtack with traditional acorn stew. They wore brass military buttons sewn onto deerskin shirts their grandmothers had made. Some soldiers learned enough Apache to give simple commands. Some scouts picked up enough English to curse like cavalrymen. But this wasn't just cultural exchange, this was warfare. And the first real test came at Salt River Canyon in 1872. Picture terrain so vertical that soldiers had to lower their horses on ropes to reach the canyon floor. The scouts led them down a trail so steep that one wrong step meant a 1,000-foot fall onto rocks below. At dawn, they struck an Apache rancheria with complete surprise, the first truly decisive victory American forces had achieved in this war. But victory came with a bitter taste that would haunt many of the scouts for the rest of their lives. As they walked through the aftermath, Apache scouts recognized faces among the dead: cousins, childhood friends, people they had grown up with who had made different choices about how to survive in this changing world. That's the psychological burden you have to understand if you want to grasp what these scouts were going through. They weren't just soldiers, they were family members, hunting family members. They were using their most sacred knowledge, the skills that had kept their people alive for centuries, to track down and kill other Apache who were fighting for the same thing they all wanted: the right to live as Apache in Apache country. The campaign expanded as more Apache bands saw what Crook's scouts were accomplishing. Some joined to protect their families from the starvation that was becoming common on overcrowded reservations. Others signed up for that $13 monthly pay, which meant the difference between watching your children go hungry and being able to feed them. Many enlisted because warrior blood demanded action, and if you couldn't fight as a free Apache, at least you could fight as an Army scout. But perhaps the most powerful motivation was fear. Word spread through Apacheria that these scout units were creating an intelligence network unlike anything that had ever existed. Every waterhole was watched. Every traditional trail was monitored. Every hideout that had been secret for generations was now known to men who wore blue uniforms but thought like Apache. The psychological warfare was devastating. Imagine being a hostile Apache leader trying to plan a raid, knowing that your every move might be anticipated by people who had learned tracking from the same elders you had. Your own tactical thinking, the very skills that made you dangerous, were now being used against you by men who could predict your decisions because they would make the same ones. By 1883, 500 Apache scouts were serving across Arizona and New Mexico territories. They prevented more raids through pure intimidation than they stopped through combat. Hostile Apache bands found themselves in an impossible situation. They were being hunted by people who knew exactly how they thought, where they would go, and what they would do next. The scouts had accomplished something that 20 years of conventional military operations had failed to achieve. They had made Apache resistance unsustainable, not through superior firepower, but through superior knowledge. They had turned the Apache mastery of their homeland against itself, creating a situation where the very skills that had made Apache warriors invincible were now serving the United States Army. But the ultimate test was still coming. In the Sierra Madre Mountains of Mexico, a medicine man turned war leader named Geronimo was watching these developments and planning one last desperate bid for Apache freedom. He had survived everything the army could throw at him, but now he would face something entirely different. Apache scouts, who knew him personally, who understood his every tactical innovation, who could think like he thought and move like he moved. The greatest manhunt in American military history was about to begin, and it would pit the most famous Apache warrior who ever lived against his own people wearing United States Army blue. When Geronimo fled San Carlos Reservation with 42 followers on May 17, 1883, he triggered what would become the greatest manhunt in American military history. But this wasn't just any Apache leader making a run for freedom. This was a man whose very name had become synonymous with everything Americans feared about Apache warfare. Geronimo wasn't even his real name. Born Goyacla, meaning one who yawns, he had earned his war name after Mexican soldiers cried out to Saint Jerome San Geronimo as he cut through them with a knife during a revenge raid. Think about that. A name that started as an enemy's. Prayer for divine protection became the most feared word on the southwestern frontier. At 54 years old, Geronimo possessed an almost supernatural knowledge of the borderland between Arizona and Mexico. He knew every canyon, every hidden spring, every secret trail through mountains that rose like broken teeth from the desert floor. More importantly, he had family connections throughout Apacheria relatives who might feed him, cousins who could provide information, old allies who remembered when he had been a respected leader rather than a hunted fugitive. But what made Geronimo truly dangerous was something you couldn't measure or map, an uncanny ability to sense danger that had kept him alive through 30 years of warfare. Other Apache leaders called him a medicine man, someone who could see things others couldn't. Skeptics said he was just paranoid and lucky. Either way, he had survived every trap, every ambush, every pursuit that had been thrown at him. General Crook knew that conventional tactics would never catch Geronimo. Instead, he assembled the most lethal tracking force ever created. Apache scouts who knew Geronimo personally, not just knew about him, knew him, had eaten with him, fought beside him, listened to his stories around campfires before the world had forced them to choose sides. Chateau was the key to everything. Once one of Geronimo's most trusted lieutenants, he had led some of the most devastating raids in Apache history before deciding that resistance was suicide. Now he wore the chevrons of an army sergeant and carried the psychological burden of hunting his former chief. Imagine the complexity of that relationship, tracking a man who had once been like a father to you, using skills he had taught you to bring him down. The chase became a deadly chess match played across two nations. Geronimo would strike ranches in Arizona, then vanish into Mexico's Sierra Madre, where legal jurisdiction ended and geography became even more unforgiving. The Apache scouts pioneered something called hot pursuit, diplomatic agreements that allowed them to chase hostile bands across international borders without stopping for paperwork. Picture the scene. Mule trains loaded with supplies following Apache scouts through mountains so rough that animals fell off cliffs daily. Every morning brought the discovery of dead pack animals at the bottom of 1,000-foot drops. Water was so scarce that men fought over the privilege of drinking first from muddy pools. And through it all, Geronimo stayed just ahead of them, leaving behind exhausted horses and wounded followers like breadcrumbs on a trail that seemed to lead nowhere. At Turkey Creek, the scouts finally cornered Geronimo's band in what should have been the end of the chase. But when the sun rose, they found only cold campfires and tracks leading in 6 different directions. Somewhere in the darkness, Geronimo had sensed the trap and scattered his people like smoke in the wind. It was like trying to hold water in your hands. The psychological warfare intensified as scouts began leaving messages at waterholes, surrender terms written in Apache, promises of fair treatment, warnings that continued resistance meant certain death. But they also left other messages, ones that cut deeper than any bullet. Personal appeals from relatives, letters from children asking their fathers to come home, reminders of what was being lost with every day of flight. The pressure began to tell. Women and children started deserting Geronimo's band, worn down by constant movement, inadequate food, and the knowledge that they were being hunted by people who knew every hiding place they might use. Geronimo's force of 42 began shrinking as families slipped away in the night, choosing reservation life over a freedom that felt increasingly like a death sentence. In March 1886, Scouts Alcacay and Deadshot tracked Geronimo to what they thought was his final stronghold in Mexico's Torres Mountains. Picture terrain so vertical that you needed ropes to move between levels, where one defensive position could hold off an army. But instead of attacking, they did something that showed how completely they understood Apache psychology. They sent in Geronimo's favorite nephew to negotiate. For 2 days, Geronimo wavered between his dreams of power and the exhausted reality around him. General Miles had replaced Crook and was demanding unconditional surrender, but he was promising exile rather than execution. The offer split what remained of Geronimo's followers. Some wanted to fight to the death rather than live as prisoners. Others were simply too tired to care anymore. The final mission fell to 2 scouts whose names deserve to be remembered, Martin and Caita. They volunteered to approach Geronimo's camp one last time, knowing that he might kill them on sight as traitors. Think about the courage that required. Walking into a hostile camp where your former friends might execute you for wearing a blue uniform. They found Geronimo with only 21 followers, left warriors who had once controlled millions of acres of southwestern territory, now reduced to eating roots and horse meat in a hidden canyon. "You have struggled in vain," Martin told him in Apache. "The White Eyes are everywhere. Their scouts know every trail, every waterhole, every place you might hide. There is no more free country left." At Skeleton Canyon on September 4, 1886, Geronimo surrendered his rifle to General Miles while Apache scouts watched from nearby rocks. Some watched with satisfaction, knowing that the last chapter of Apache resistance was finally closing. Others recognized that something larger had died, not just Geronimo's war, but the entire world they had all been born into. The surrender ended the Apache Wars, but it also marked the end of something that had existed for centuries. The possibility of living as a free Apache in Apache country. The scouts had accomplished their mission with devastating efficiency. They had used their most sacred knowledge, the skills passed down from their grandfathers, to eliminate the last obstacle to American control of the Southwest. But victory came with a price that none of them had anticipated. As Geronimo laid down his rifle, he looked at the Apache scouts surrounding him and said something that would haunt them for the rest of their lives. "You have killed your own people to please your enemies. What will you tell your children when they ask why Apache no longer live free?" It was a question that would echo through the decades to come, as the scouts discovered that serving the United States Army faithfully didn't guarantee that the United States would treat them as anything more than useful tools to be discarded when their usefulness ended. The greatest manhunt in American history was over, but the most bitter chapter of the Apache scout story was about to begin. The victory celebrations lasted exactly as long as it took for the true cost of victory to become clear. General Nelson Miles, basking in the glory of Geronimo's surrender, decided that one Apache was much like another when it came to potential threats. His solution was elegant in its simplicity and devastating in its betrayal. Every Chiricahua Apache would be shipped to prison camps in Florida, including the scouts who had risked everything to make that surrender possible. Picture the scene at Fort Bowie. Chateau and 13 other Apache scouts, the very men who had tracked Geronimo through the Sierra Madre and convinced him to surrender, being arrested while visiting Washington to receive Congressional Medals of Honor for their service. Think about that irony, decorated war heroes being loaded into the same prison rail cars as the men they had spent 3 years hunting. The betrayal was so complete it would have been almost funny if it weren't so tragic. These scouts had done everything the United States Army had asked of them. They had turned against their own people. They had used sacred knowledge to hunt down the last free Apache. They had risked execution as traitors to end a war that was bleeding both sides white. And their reward? Prison bars and exile to a climate that would kill more Apache than all the bullets fired in 30 years of warfare. At Fort Marion, Florida, decorated war heroes found themselves behind the same barbed wire as the men they had hunted. Chateau, who wore the Medal of Honor, shared a barracks with warriors who had once followed his orders to raid American settlements. The psychological complexity of that situation defies description. These men had to live together, eat together, watch their children die together in a humid climate that Apache lungs were never meant to breathe. Children died first, as they always do. Tuberculosis swept through the prison camps like wildfire through drought grass. Warriors who had survived everything the desert could throw at them succumbed to diseases that didn't exist in their homeland. Families that had endured decades of warfare were shattered across different prison camps, with no way to know if their relatives were alive or dead. Alcacey, using his Medal of Honor as leverage, began a letter-writing campaign that would last for years. Picture this decorated veteran, a man who had served the United States faithfully in the most dangerous conditions imaginable, having to petition Washington for basic human rights for his people. His letters were masterpieces of diplomacy written in broken English, pleading for fair treatment while carefully avoiding any criticism that might make things worse. 10 Apache scouts had received the Medal of Honor, the first Native Americans ever to be so recognized by the United States government. But those medals couldn't be spent at trading posts. They couldn't vote. They couldn't own property. They returned to reservations where they existed in a legal limbo, not quite citizens, not quite enemies, but something in between that satisfied no one. The Western Apache scouts who remained in Arizona faced different but equally complex challenges. Their military pensions of $12 monthly made them wealthy by reservation standards, which created its own problems. Extended families expected support. Traditional obligations required sharing wealth. Some scouts found themselves supporting dozens of relatives on their army pay, creating resentment and obligation in equal measure. Traditional Apache warrior societies transformed into something entirely new, veterans organizations where old scouts gathered to tell stories in a mixture of English and Apache that their grandchildren struggled to understand. Picture aged warriors sitting around trading post stoves, trying to explain to teenagers who had never known freedom what it felt like to track enemies through country that belonged to no government. Some scouts found new purpose training the Army's last Apache scout units, teaching tracking skills to soldiers who would probably never use them. The world was changing too fast for those skills to matter much longer. Railroads were bringing civilization to the most remote corners of Arizona. Telegraph lines carried messages faster than smoke signals, and automobiles were beginning to appear on roads that had once known only horses and human feet. Others became tribal police, using their bilingual skills and understanding of both cultures to navigate between federal authorities and their people. It was thankless work enforcing laws they hadn't made on people who often didn't understand why those laws existed. But it was also necessary work, helping their communities adapt to a legal system that operated by completely different rules than traditional Apache justice. Mickey Free lived until 1914, the one-eyed scout who had tracked Geronimo through every hideout in the Sierra Madre. His death came in a Model T Ford accident on a road near Fort Apache, the man who had survived 30 years of Apache warfare, finally killed by the modern world he had helped create. There's something profoundly symbolic about that. The scout who had bridged two worlds, destroyed by the very technology that made those worlds incompatible. The last Apache scout to retire was William Major, who served until 1947 after fighting in both world wars. At his retirement ceremony, he wore his grandfather's medicine bundle under his dress uniform, still walking between two worlds, still trying to honor both the old ways and the new obligations. He was 73 years old and had spent his entire adult life serving a government that had never quite decided what to do with people like him. Major remembered when 5,000 Apache had controlled millions of acres across Arizona, New Mexico, and northern Mexico. Now, 30,000 Apache lived on reservations, totaling 3 million acres, still substantial territory, but nothing compared to the endless country their grandfathers had roamed freely. The conquest had been achieved not through superior firepower or brilliant strategy, but through something far more effective and far more heartbreaking, turning warrior against warrior in a campaign that proved devastatingly successful. The Apache Scout program had accomplished everything the United States military had hoped for and more. It had ended Apache resistance without the massive casualties that conventional warfare would have required. It had provided employment and purpose for men who might otherwise have continued fighting indefinitely. It had created a model for using indigenous knowledge that would influence military thinking for generations. But the human cost was immeasurable. The Scouts had preserved their lives and the lives of their families by sacrificing their culture's most fundamental principles. They had survived by becoming something their grandfathers would not have recognized. They had saved their people by helping to destroy their people's way of life. The last chapter of the Apache Scout story isn't about military victory or defeat, it's about the price of survival in a world where the old ways no longer worked. These men had faced an impossible choice: resist and die, or adapt and live with the knowledge that your survival came at the cost of everything you had been raised to believe was sacred. They chose survival, and they paid for it every day for the rest of their lives. In the end, perhaps that's the most Apache thing about them. They endured. They found a way to continue existing as Apache people in a world that no longer had room for Apache warriors. And in doing so, they ensured that something of their culture would survive, even if it was changed beyond recognition. The thunder had crossed the desert, the blue coats had triumphed, and the last free Apache had surrendered. But somewhere in the mountains of Arizona, old scouts still gathered to tell stories in two languages about the time when the world changed forever, and they had to choose which side of history they wanted to be on.